only in the regional conflict zones, but also in quite prosperous countries, thus engendering enormous risks. In this regard, matters related to cybersecurity and the use of advanced digital technology also deserve most serious deliberation within the UN. It is important to hear and appreciate the concerns of people over the protection of their rights, such as the right to privacy, property, and security in the new era. We must learn to use new technologies for the benefit of humankind, to seek for a right balance between encouraging the development of artificial intelligence and justifiable restrictions to limit it, and work together towards a consensus in the field of regulation that would avert potential threats in terms of both military and technological security, as well as traditions, law, and the morals of human communication. I would like to point out that during the pandemic, doctors, volunteers, and citizens of various countries have been showing us examples of mutual assistance and support, and such solidarity defies borders. Many countries have also been helping each other selflessly and open-heartedly. However, there have been cases showing the deficit of humanity and, if you will, kindness in the relations at the official interstate level. We believe that the UN's prestige could strengthen and enhance the role of the humanitarian or human component in multilateral and bilateral relations, namely in people-to-people and youth exchanges, cultural ties, social and educational programs, as well as cooperation in sports, science, technology, environment, and health protection. As to healthcare, just like in economy, we now need to remove as many as possible of the obstacles to partner relations. Our country has been actively contributing to global and regional counter-COVID-19 efforts, providing assistance to most affected states, both bilaterally and within multilateral formats. In so doing, we first of all take into account the central coordinating role of the World Health Organization, which is part of the UN system. We believe it is essential to qualitatively strengthen the WHO's capability. This work has already begun, and Russia is genuinely motivated to engage in it. Building on the scientific, industrial, and clinical experience of its doctors, Russia has promptly developed a range of testing systems and medicines to detect and treat the coronavirus, as well as registering the world's first vaccine, Sputnik V. I would like to reiterate that we are completely open to partner relations and willing to cooperate. In this context, we are proposing to hold an online high-level conference shortly for countries interested in cooperation in the development of anti-coronavirus vaccines. We are ready to share our experience and continue cooperating with all states and international entities, including in supplying the Russian vaccine, which has proved reliable, safe, and effective to other countries. Russia is sure that all capacities of the global pharmaceutical industry need to be employed so as to provide free access to vaccination for the population of all states in the foreseeable future. A dangerous virus can affect anyone. The coronavirus has struck the staff of the United Nations, its headquarters, and regional structures just like everyone else. Russia is ready to provide the UN with all the necessary qualified assistance. In particular, we are offering to provide our vaccine free of charge for the voluntary vaccination of the staff of the UN and its offices. We have received requests from our UN colleagues in this respect, and we will respond to these. There are other critical items on the UN's agenda. The issues of both environmental protection and climate change should remain the focus of joint efforts. The specialised multilateral UN conventions, treaties and protocols have proved fully relevant. We are calling on all states to comply with them in good faith, particularly in working to achieve the objectives of the Paris Agreement. Dear colleagues, I would like to underline again that Russia will make every effort to contribute to peaceful, political and diplomatic resolution of regional crises and conflicts, as well as to ensuring strategic stability. For all the disputes and differences, at times misunderstanding and even distrust on the part of some colleagues, we will consistently advance constructive, uniting initiatives, first of all in arms control, and strengthening the treaty regimes existing in this area. These include the prohibition of chemical, biological, and toxic weapons. The issue of primary importance that should and must be promptly dealt with is, of course, the extension of the Russia-US Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, which will expire shortly in February 2021. We are engaged in negotiations with our US partners on the matter. We also expect that mutual restraint would be exercised with regard to deploying new missile systems. I would like to add that as early as last year, and I emphasize this, Russia declared a moratorium on deploying ground-launched medium and long-range missiles in Europe and other regions, as long as the United States of America also refrain from such actions. Unfortunately, we have not received any reaction to our proposal from either our US partners or their allies. I believe that such reciprocal steps on specific issues would provide a sound basis for launching a serious, profound dialogue on the entire range of factors affecting strategic stability. It would aim at achieving comprehensive arrangements, shaping a solid foundation for the international security architecture that would build on prior experience in this field and in line with both the existing and future political, military and technological realia. In particular, Russia is promoting an initiative to sign a binding agreement between all the leading space powers that would provide for the prohibition of the placement of weapons in outer space or the threat or use of force against outer space objects. We are well aware of the fact that security issues, as well as other problems discussed by this Jubilee UN General Assembly, call for consolidated efforts on the basis of values that unite us, our shared memory of the lessons of history, and the spirit of alliance which guided the anti-Hitler coalition participants, who found it possible to rise above differences and ideological preferences for the sake of victory and peace for all nations on the earth. In the current challenging environment, it is important for all countries to show political will, wisdom and foresight. The permanent members of the UN Security Council, those powers that for 75 years now have been bearing particular responsibility for international peace and security, the preservation of the foundations of international law should take the lead here. Fully realizing this responsibility, Russia has suggested convening a G5 summit. It would aim at reaffirming the key principles of behavior in international affairs, elaborating ways to effectively address today's most burning issues. It is encouraging that our partners have supported the initiative. We expect to hold such a summit in person as soon as epidemiological situation would make it possible. I would like to reiterate that in an interrelated, interdependent world, amid the whirlpool of international developments, we need to work together, drawing on the principles and norms of international law enshrined in the UN Charter. This is the only way for us to carry out the paramount mission of our organization and provide a decent life for present and future generations. I wish all the peoples of our planet peace and well-being. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished President of the Russian Federation. I now give the floor to the distinguished delegate of the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan.
Mr. President, of the General Assembly, Mr. Secretary General of the United Nations, Excellencies, I have the great honor to introduce the pre-recorded statement of His Majesty King Abdullah II of the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. I thank you.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, Your Excellencies, these are indeed extraordinary times in our history and in the history of the United Nations when we find ourselves meeting virtually for the first time in the UN's 75 years as our world continues to grapple with COVID-19 and its far-reaching implications, and as our people look towards us to navigate these uncharted waters with bold statesmanship. It is incredible how a virus that infected a single person in one corner of the globe has grown and expanded to hit the very foundations of our international system, our global economy, all of humanity. It will be equally incredible if the lesson of just how interconnected we really are is lost on us. We cannot beat this virus by turning inwards. It does not stop at borders, and nor should our cooperation. We can only overcome COVID-19 and what comes beyond it through a renewed integration of our world, a re-globalization that makes the well-being of all our peoples the ultimate goal. A re-globalization that capitalizes on each country's potential, its strengths and resources with regional safety nets, keeping the flow of vital supplies open. A re-globalization that better equips us for a post-COVID-19 world. My friends, among the multiple challenges that our world will have to face is hunger at a substantially larger scale than previous decades. Indeed, it has already begun to creep up on us. We see threats to food security in Lebanon. We see hunger threatening vulnerable refugee communities in our region. We see it threatening communities living in poverty across the Middle East, Africa, Latin America, and elsewhere. Preparing for this is a key priority for Jordan, and we also stand ready to do what we can for our region and our friends by channeling our capabilities to operate as a regional hub for food security. And it is out of our belief in the importance of maintaining food security for generations to come that we also are strongly committed to safeguarding the main source of humanity's substance, our environment. Recognizing that protecting our national environment would ultimately protect all existence. Jordan drafted a charter to be submitted to the UNGA that grants selected ecosystems and all species of flora and fauna the legal right to exist, and thus ensuring humanity itself continues to exist. This initiative would be in line with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which contribute to safeguarding our environment for the prosperity of our world. My friends, the COVID-19 crisis has brought a mirror to our world and shown us the cracks in our global system. In so doing, it has offered us what could be a historic moment to rethink the role of the United Nations and other multilateral organizations to become more impactful in dealing with challenges old and new, be they pandemics or raging conflicts. As long as injustice and lack of peace persist anywhere in the world, the UN must not rest. We must not rest. The Palestinian-Israeli conflict is the one conflict that started with the UN's formation and that continues to fester to this very day. The only way towards an end to this conflict, the central conflict in my region, is through the two-state solution in accordance with international law and UN resolutions. The only way towards just and lasting peace must lead to an independent, sovereign, and viable Palestinian state on the June 4th, 1967 lines with East Jerusalem as its capital, living side by side with Israel in mutual peace and security. And we cannot resolve this conflict without working to preserve Jerusalem for all humanity as a unifying city of peace. As Hashemite custodian, I am bound by a special duty to safeguard Jerusalem's Islamic and Christian holy sites. But the responsibility for the holy city falls on us all. My friends, Jordan joined the United Nations a decade after its founding. Ever since, we have embraced our role as an active member state working towards global peace and sustainable development. In the 75th anniversary of this important body, we remain deeply committed to its promise in building a more prosperous, inclusive, and peaceful world. And we see in these extraordinary times an opportunity to help fulfill that promise. Let us use this opportunity to be bolder in our ambitions, bolder in our actions, and bolder in believing in our ability to succeed. Thank you.
On behalf of the General Assembly, I wish to thank the King of the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan for the statement just made. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Republic of Korea to introduce an address by the head of state.
Mr. President, I now have the honor to introduce the pre-recorded video message of His Excellency Mr. Moon Jae-in, President of the Republic of Korea.
Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, and distinguished delegates, humanity has overcome a myriad of crises to date to build the civilization we live in today. Although we are now in the middle of the COVID-19 crisis, humanity will surely once again make astonishing strides toward a tomorrow that is different from today. I'd like to offer my deepest sympathies to the victims of COVID-19 and their bereaved families and all of those around the world who are fighting the disease. My gratitude also goes out to the medical staff, frontline workers, and staff members of international organizations who are putting themselves at risk to protect the health of humanity. The 75th session of the UN General Assembly will go a long way toward triumphing over an unprecedented crisis. Let me extend my congratulations to you, Mr. Volkan Bozkır, on your assumption of the presidency. I have high hopes for your able leadership. I would also like to express my respect to Secretary General Antonio Guterres for his tireless efforts to resolve numerous global challenges, from infectious diseases to peace, the economy, the environment, and human rights. Mr. President, the COVID-19 crisis we face is upending daily lives of humanity and agitating even the world economy and international order. Just as the far-sighted leaders created the United Nations 75 years ago, it is high time that we pull our wisdom again to find our guiding star in this time of great transformation. The Republic of Korea took key values of democracy and turned them into three main principles of infectious disease prevention: openness, transparency, and democracy, and the entire Korean people turned themselves into the main actors in infectious disease prevention efforts. Korea also combined multilateralism with its community spirit, enabling people to practice the spirit of freedom for all. The Korean people protected their own safety by protecting that of neighbors. The Korean government extended the scope of neighbors beyond its borders. By sharing infectious disease prevention equipment with other countries without closing borders, Korea is keeping our country and economy intact. We learned that in the end, what empowers Korea to weather the novel coronavirus was the very values cultivated by humanity and championed by the UN. The answer to overcoming COVID-19 is not far from us. It lies in returning to the spirit of the UN Charter, that is, believing in universal values of humankind. And it lies in marching toward a more inclusive world through multilateral action. The far-sighted leaders in the past created the UN dreaming of a better world and achieved a brilliant feat of promoting universal values of humankind. In the post-COVID-19 era, the UN should be tasked with spreading these universal values even further to resolve complex global challenges such as cooperation in healthcare, economic cooperation for sustainable development, and climate action. The battles each and every country has been fighting this year have clearly demonstrated that the crisis cannot be overcome by a single country alone or without consideration of neighbors. Today, with the UN assuming a new job in the post-COVID-19 era, I'd like to address the importance of strengthening inclusiveness in international cooperation, a way to shape multilateralism in a way that makes everyone prosperous. Mr. President, strengthening inclusiveness in international cooperation means leaving no one behind and achieving shared prosperity where everyone enjoys freedom. Domestically, it is reducing inequalities to ensure safety of one's own and sustainable development together with neighbors. Internationally, it is taking into account the conditions and circumstances neighboring countries are put in while working with them to attain co-prosperity. Nothing is more important than life and safety of humanity. It is evident that the UN's idea of inclusive multilateralism will first be tested by whether it can distribute COVID-19 vaccines to all nations or not. We must not only enhance international cooperation for developing vaccines and treatments, but also guarantee their equitable access for all countries once they are developed. Through global funding, we should facilitate advanced purchase of sufficient doses of vaccines for international organizations to ensure that impoverished and developing countries can also share in the benefit. Korea is actively participating in the COVAX facility led by the World Health Organization and Gavi. Home to the headquarters of the International Vaccine Institute, Korea will provide active support to various activities geared toward developing and distributing affordable vaccines for developing countries. As concerns remain over the possibility of the second and third wave of COVID-19, Korea will actively share its experiences accumulated from responding to COVID-19 and continue to work with the international community. Like a tsunami that follows an earthquake, economic aftershocks are sweeping us. Border shutdowns and atrophied exchanges of people and goods make the global economic recovery harder. Although it is indeed an extraordinarily difficult task, we must make the best of both worlds, preventing infectious disease and reviving the economy. Even in the midst of the COVID-19 crisis, we should strengthen multilateralism characterized by solidarity and cooperation and bolster free trade system built upon international norms. Korea strives to safeguard global supply chain against disruptions and facilitate essential cross-border movement of people, including business people. Korea will share its development experience with developing countries and join the concerted global efforts to achieve UN Sustainable Development Goals. In order to enhance inclusiveness that drives sustainable development, we should break the matter of course that crisis begets widening inequalities and revive our economy in a way that leaves no one behind. Korea has taken on a challenge of the Korean New Deal. Standing on the two pillars of Digital New Deal and Green New Deal, it marks a complete transformation of Korean economy and promises to render our society less unequal and more inclusive. Korea will work with all nations to minimize the effect of COVID-19 and hasten economic recovery and actively participate in international cooperation to promote inclusive multilateralism the UN is seeking to accomplish. September 7th was the International Day of Clean Air for Blue Skies, which was proposed by Korea and subsequently adopted at the United Nations. Once human activities came to a halt, blue skies re-emerged in parts of the world. The coronavirus has paradoxically given us hope that, with the efforts of countries and international society, humanity can restore a green earth. With the UN playing a key role, I anticipate greater international cooperation take place in pursuit of building back better and greener. Korea is playing an active role in establishing a new climate regime, for instance, by faithfully implementing the Paris Agreement. By renewing nationally determined contributions, we will submit to the UN our fresh national greenhouse gas reduction targets by 2030 by the end of this year. By devising a long-term, low greenhouse gas emission development strategy, we'll work with the international community in realizing a low-carbon society by 2050. In order to respond to climate change with success, promoting inclusiveness in its international cooperation is indispensable. It is impossible for developing countries still in the process of industrialization to instantly catch up with advanced economies that took centuries and decades in the making. Starting with recognizing the glaring gaps, developed countries should make greater efforts to find the optimal solution. As a bridging state connecting developed and developing countries, Korea will actively participate in climate action and faithfully share its unique development experience with developing countries. Next year, Korea will hold the second P4G summit in Seoul, which will serve as an occasion to affirm the importance of global solidarity in responding to climate change. Mr. President, the region in the most urgent need of the spirit of the UN to realize world peace is the Korean Peninsula. The Republic of Korea has been steadfast in seeking inter-Korean reconciliation and is making relentless efforts to achieve denuclearization and establish permanent peace on the Korean Peninsula. With the support and encouragement extended by the international community, Korea was able to successfully host Pyeongchang Olympic Winter Games as Peace Olympics joined by North Korea, and it led to 3 inter-Korean summit meetings. The U.S.-North Korea summit, brought by bold decisions from the leaders of the two sides, proved that the peace process can progress through dialogue. At the UN General Assembly last year, I presented the 3 principles to resolve issues related to the Korean War: zero tolerance for war, a mutual security guarantee, and co-prosperity, and set out my vision to transform the demilitarized zone into an international peace zone. However, peace on the Korean Peninsula is still in the making, and changes that used to be brimming with hopes have stalled. Yet the Republic of Korea will continue the dialogue. What all of us need to do is to take one more step forward. My belief remains unchanged that we can achieve denuclearization and bring lasting peace on the Korean Peninsula with the international community's continued support and cooperation. At the end of the day, the South and the North are bound by a single community of life, intertwined by mountains, rivers, and seas stretching across the two sides. When one is exposed to infectious diseases or natural disasters, so is the other, requiring the two to cooperate to overcome these challenges. Inter-Korean cooperation in disease prevention and control and public health would also trigger dialogue and cooperation in the process of building a peaceful Korean Peninsula. Today, the world is expanding the concept of security from traditional security of preserving territorial integrity to comprehensive security. The world has been joining forces to respond to non-traditional security threats, from disasters and catastrophes to terrorism and cybersecurity, and to fight international crimes. However, in the face of the COVID-19 crisis that poses greater threat to humanity than a war, we came to be acutely reminded that the safety of neighboring countries is directly linked to that of our own. A single country can no longer manage the entirety of comprehensive security issues alone. As protecting peace of one country and saving life of one person now requires cooperation that transcends borders, we need to equip ourselves with a multilateral security architecture. So far, I have spoken about a peace economy that benefits both Koreas and makes everyone prosperous, and stressed the need for inter-Korean cooperation in disaster response and healthcare. Hoping that the international community views the issues surrounding the Korean Peninsula through the lens of more inclusive international cooperation, I propose today launching a Northeast Asia Cooperation Initiative for Infectious Disease Control and Public Health, whereby North Korea participates as a member along with China, Japan, Mongolia, and the Republic of Korea. A cooperative architecture that guarantees collective protection of life and safety will lay the ground for North Korea to have its security guaranteed by engaging with the international community. In particular, this year marks the 70th anniversary of the outbreak of the Korean War. Time has come to remove the tragedy lingering on the Korean Peninsula. The war must end completely and for good. Peace on the Korean Peninsula will guarantee peace in Northeast Asia as a whole, and going one step further, bring positive changes to the world order as well. I believe it begins with declaring an end to the war, an act that can affirm mutual commitments to peace. I hope that the UN and the international community provide support so that we can advance into an era of reconciliation and prosperity through the End of War Declaration. The End of War Declaration will indeed open the door to complete denuclearization and permanent peace regime on the Korean Peninsula. It is not only Korea's response to COVID-19, but also the invaluable lessons Korea will be gaining from institutionalizing peace that Korea wishes to share with the rest of the world. This way, we'll be able to buttress UN's efforts at the forefront to fulfill its purpose to maintain international peace through collective measures. Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, and distinguished delegates, COVID-19 has showed us how closely interconnected the world is, and humanity will in the end head into an era of solidarity and cooperation. We have to prepare for the future and at the same time change the world we live in today. If people start with small things, each and everyone's actions will unite and culminate in the freedom for all today. I'd like to ask the UN from this moment onward to be the center of inclusive international cooperation in the new era. Thank you.
On behalf of the General Assembly, I wish to thank the President of the Republic of Korea for the statement just made. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Qatar to introduce an address by the head of state.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to introduce the recorded statement by His Highness Sheikh Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani, Emir of the State of Qatar. In the name of God, the Merciful, the Compassionate. Your Excellency, President of the General Assembly, Your Excellency, Secretary General of the United Nations, ladies and gentlemen, may the peace and blessings of God be upon you. At the outset, I congratulate His Excellency, Mr. Volkan Bozkir, on assuming the presidency of the 75th session of the General Assembly, wishing him every success. I also thank His Excellency, Mr. Tijani Muhammad Bande, President of the previous session, for the appreciated efforts he exerted during his tenure, and I avail myself of this opportunity to commend the role of His Excellency, the Secretary General, Mr. Antonio Guterres, in promoting the role of the United Nations and achieving its goals. Mr. President, this session coincides with celebrating the 75th anniversary of the founding of the United Nations, and it is opportune on this occasion to remember that the UN is an institutional embodiment of our awareness that we belong to one humanity. There are many historical experiences that prove this fact and show that we should not underestimate it. The outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic has reminded us that we live on the same planet and that multilateral cooperation is the only way to address the challenges of epidemics and the challenges related to the climate and the environment. We ought to remember that also when dealing with the issues of poverty, war, and peace, and achieving our common goals of security and stability. The state of Qatar promptly took all necessary preventive measures to protect its citizens and the residents on its territory. However, it has also provided aid to more than 60 countries and 5 international organizations. We have been participating actively in international efforts to mobilize resources and capacities to address this epidemic and its repercussions. We have been supporting research centers in several countries to reduce the negative effects of this pandemic and to expedite the development of a vaccine for this virus. Mr. President, more than 3 years have passed since the start of the unjust and illegal blockade on the state of Qatar. Nevertheless, we kept to the path towards progress and development in various fields. Despite the blockade, Qatar has strengthened its effective participation in the multilateral international efforts to find solutions to different crises. Throughout the unjust and unlawful blockade, we have consolidated our policies, which are based on the respect of the principles and provisions of international law and the United Nations Charter, especially the principle of respecting the sovereignty of states and rejecting any interference in the internal affairs of states. We bear a moral and legal responsibility towards our peoples. We have stressed, and we will continue to stress, that unconditional dialogue based on common interests and respect for the sovereignty of states is the way to solve this crisis. It started with imposing an illegal blockade, and lifting this blockade would be the first step to end it. On this occasion, I reiterate my deep appreciation for the sincere efforts of His Highness Sheikh Sabah Al Ahmed Al Jaber Al Sabah, Amir of the Brotherly State of Kuwait, and I would like to highly value the efforts of other brotherly and friendly countries to bring this crisis to an end. Ladies and gentlemen, there is international consensus on the fact that the Palestinian cause is a just cause, but despite this consensus, the international community stands by, unable to take any effective action to confront Israeli intransigence, its continued occupation of Palestinian and Arab land, the imposition of a stifling siege on the Gaza Strip, the expanding settlement policy, among others. Israel is imposing a fait accompli in a flagrant violation of international resolutions and the two-state solution agreed upon by the international community. Just peace can only be achieved when Israel fully commits to the international terms of reference resolutions that are accepted by the Arab countries and upon which the Arab Peace Initiative is based. Israel is trying to circumvent these parameters and acts as if the Palestinian cause did not exist. Any arrangements that are not based on these parameters will not achieve peace, even if they are called arrangements for peace. Those arrangements do not aim to achieve just solution to the Palestinian cause. They do not aim to achieve comprehensive, just and lasting peace. Failure to find a just solution to the Palestinian cause, Israel's continued settlements, and forcing a new reality on the ground without being deterred, this is what raises the biggest question about the credibility of the international community and its institutions. We call upon the international community, especially the Security Council, to assume its legal responsibilities and compel Israel to lift the siege on Gaza Strip, to put the peace process back on track through credible negotiations based on international resolutions and not on force. Negotiations must address all final status issues. They must end the occupation within a specific time frame. They must lead to the establishment of an independent Palestinian state within the 1967 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital. They must end the Israeli occupation of all Arab territories. As part of our efforts to create the appropriate conditions to achieve peace and to respond to the economic and humanitarian difficulties facing our brothers in Palestine, we, in coordination with our international partners, have continued providing humanitarian and development aid to respond to the urgent and long-term needs in the besieged Gaza Strip, in addition to increasing our contributions to UNRWA. Mr. President, we firmly believe in resolving disputes by peaceful means. With the grace of God, the State of Qatar's mediation efforts have culminated in signing a peace agreement between the United States and the Taliban movement in Doha on the 29th of February 2020. Discussions held in Doha last month led to the successful exchange of prisoners between the government of Afghanistan and the Taliban movement. In cooperation with our international partners, we successfully contributed to convening the intra-Afghan peace negotiations, which began on the 12th of this month in Doha. The success of these negotiations now depends on our Afghan brothers themselves. In cooperation with the international community, we will spare no effort to facilitate the dialogue, in the hope that peace and stability would soon prevail across Afghanistan if everyone decides to completely renounce violence and accept diversity and equal citizenship. Mr. President, more than 9 years have passed since the beginning of the Syrian crisis. It has brought unprecedented tragedy to people's lives, and its impact is getting worse year after year. Yet, the crisis has not been resolved due to the intransigence of the Syrian regime and the failure of the international community, especially the Security Council, to assume its duty to maintain international peace and security and protect civilians. The Syrian regime still obstructs even the process of drafting a new constitution proposed by Russia, which unfortunately is all that was left of the international efforts aiming to achieve some form of a peaceful solution. The regime deals with this process using the same stalling tactics it has used before. It responded to the request of the international community and is participating in the negotiations, but without any intention to make any change. On this occasion, I reiterate the firm stance of the State of Qatar that the only way to end the Syrian crisis is a political solution based on the Geneva I communique and the implementation of Security Council Resolution 2254. The State of Qatar also affirms that it will continue with the international community to support efforts to achieve justice and hold accountable perpetrators of atrocities, war crimes, and crimes against humanity committed in Syria. In the humanitarian field, we will continue to provide all forms of support and assistance to the brotherly Syrian people in IDP and refugee areas until the end of this crisis. As for the raging war in sisterly Yemen, which is destroying its infrastructure, depriving the Yemeni people of the basic necessities of life, and threatening security in the region, we stress that the only way to resolve this crisis is through negotiation among the Yemenis in accordance with the outcomes of the national dialogue, the Gulf Initiative, relevant Security Council resolutions, particularly Resolution 2216. We stress our firm position to maintain the unity of Yemen and its territorial integrity. As for the brotherly Sudan, we value the signing of a peace agreement in Juba between the transitional government in Sudan and a number of armed movements. We express our appreciation to the state of South Sudan for sponsoring the signing of this agreement, and we look forward to the rest of the factions joining the peace process. We stress the firm stance of the state of Qatar. We will stand by the brotherly Sudanese people to successfully overcome this transitional period and achieve their aspirations for stability and development. We reiterate the call to the relevant countries to facilitate the efforts of the brothers in Sudan to remove the name of Sudan from the list of states sponsoring terrorism, as the hardships that the Sudanese people are facing has taken its toll on them. Qatar stood with the brothers by providing them with support to respond to the floods that severely damaged facilities and harmed people, and we call upon the international community to provide them with the necessary support to respond to natural disasters. Regarding the Libyan issue, we reiterate that we welcome the ceasefire agreement and the activation of the political process in accordance with the outcomes of the Sukhayrat agreement to achieve a comprehensive political settlement that will maintain Libyan sovereignty, territorial integrity and independence, that would stem the bloodshed and preserves Libya's wealth. Everybody must understand that it is impossible to impose a military regime by force in Libya. We were pained by what Lebanon went through in the aftermath of the explosion at the port of Beirut. We stood by our Lebanese brothers without conditions. It is not our habit to impose political conditions to show solidarity during disasters, but in the end, it will be incumbent the most prominent challenging facing the world, as it poses a real threat to international peace and security. It impedes achieving sustainable development for all. We, in the state of Qatar, spare no effort to actively participate in international and regional efforts to address this phenomenon and tackle its roots, especially by supporting education of millions of children, young people and women, and creating job opportunities for young men. In this context, young men and women. In this context, Qatar is strengthening the strategic partnership with the relevant United Nations agency. I'm referring here to the opening of a program office of the United Nations Counter-terrorism office in Doha next May to implement behavior-related approaches to combating terrorism and violent extremism. Mr. President, as part of its efforts to provide development assistance to developing countries and the least developed countries, and support to countries affected by the negative impact of climate change, Qatar has fulfilled its pledge by providing a contribution of $100 million to support the least developed countries and small island developing states to deal with climate change. We are pleased to host the 5th United Nations Conference on the Least Developed Countries in Doha from the 23rd to the 27th of January 2022. We're confident that this conference will support their efforts towards achieving development throughout the next decade, in line with the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. In conclusion, we reaffirm the State of Qatar's commitment to the declaration adopted by the General Assembly on the 21st of September, with the participation of the heads of state and government, and in which the State of Qatar assumed, in partnership with the Kingdom of Sweden, a role in facilitating the international negotiations for its adoption. We will continue to work with the United Nations to achieve its goals and address the common challenges to pursue the interest of our peoples and for the good of humanity. Thank you, and may God's peace, mercy and blessings be upon you.
On behalf of the General Assembly, I wish to thank the Emir of Qatar for the statement just made. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Philippines to introduce an address by the head of state.
Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, I have the special honor to introduce the pre-recorded statement of His Excellency Rodrigo Roa Duterte, President of the Republic of the Philippines.
Mr. President of the United Nations General Assembly, Mr. Secretary General, Head of the State and Government, Excellencies, I am honored to address you today on behalf of the Filipino people on the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. The invisible enemy that is COVID-19 has brought about an unfamiliar global landscape and unleashed a crisis without precedent. It is the biggest test the world and the United Nations face since World War II. While the United Nations has brought relief and hope to so many countries and peoples around the world, it now finds itself saddled by a virus that has taken many lives and wrecked economies and social order. We are at a crossroads. How we address COVID-19 will define our future. For the Philippines, this means putting up all of the peoples of our United Nations at the core of this response. We will need to ask hard and fundamental questions about the vision and mission that the United Nations conceptualized 75 years ago. We need to ask ourselves whether or not we have remained true and faithful to the United Nations principles and ideas. Mr. President, in the light of the realities of the present, the Philippines grieves with all of the families all over the world who lost their loved ones to this horrible virus. We extend our heartfelt condolences. We salute all frontliners who put up their lives on the line even in countries not their own. So also do we honor and recognize the healthcare professionals who selflessly answered the call and to combat the COVID-19 pandemic despite its virulence and unknown characteristics. While each nation has its own strategy in fighting the pandemic, what the world needs are coordinated international plans and efforts to pursue a common purpose. COVID-19 knows no border, it knows no nationality, it knows no race, it knows no gender, it knows no age, it knows no creed. The Philippines values the role that the United Nations plays in its fight against the pandemic. And a middle-income country whose economic advantages have been derailed by the pandemic, we welcome the launch of the UN COVID Response and Recovery Fund. Ensuring universal access to anti-COVID-19 technologies and products is pivotal in the global pandemic recovery. The world is in the race to find safe and effective vaccine. When the world finds that vaccine, access to it must not be denied nor withheld. It should be made available to all, rich and poor nations alike, as a matter of policy. The Philippines joins our partners in the ASEAN and the non-aligned movement, and in raising our collective voice, the COVID-19 vaccine must be considered a global public good. Let us be clear on this. We can call for a global health agenda with enough resources and policy space for the World Health Organizations. We need a WHO that is quick to coordinate and quicker to respond. The Philippines will do its part in the pooling of global resources. Our health workers are among the best. Mr. President, just as we needed stability and confidence because of the pandemic, geopolitical tensions continue to rise. Escalating tensions benefit no one. The new flashpoints heighten fears and tend to tear peoples apart. When elephants fight, it is the grass that gets trampled flat. Given the size and military might of the contenders, we can only imagine and be aghast at the terrible toll on human life and property that shall be inflicted if the world war deteriorates into a real war of nuclear weapons and missiles. I therefore call on the stakeholders in the South China Sea, the Korean Peninsula, the Middle East, and Africa. If we cannot be friends as yet, then in God's name, let us not hate each other too much. I heard it once said, and I say it to myself, complete agreement. Mr. President, Filipino migrant workers have been devastated by the pandemic. Many have lost not only their livelihood, but also their health and lives as well. Yet they go on in the front lines, healing, caring others in the different parts of the world. The Philippine government has embarked on an unprecedented repatriation program. More than 345,000 overseas Filipino workers needed to come home then. We have brought back half and are bringing back the rest. We thank the countries that have provided Filipino migrants with residence permit, access to testing, treatment, and related health services in this pandemic. We brought back most of our seafarers who were stranded because of COVID-19 restrictions. We pioneered with the IMO of the Green Lane for a safe changes of seafaring crews. In these times, we need stronger cooperation in promoting and protecting the rights of migrants, regardless of their migrant status. We must all adhere to the global compact of safe, orderly, and regular migration. Unless states include all the migrants in this response to this pandemic, no one among us is safe until everyone is safe, as the Secretary General has said. With the poverty rate reduced at 16.6% and a sustained economic growth of 6.4%. Between 2010 and 2019, the Philippines was on track to becoming an upper middle income country by the end of 2020. But the pandemic has placed our economy in recession. Despite this downward pressure on growth, the Philippines remains committed to the Sustainable Development Goals. Mr. President, the same urgency needed to fight COVID-19 is needed to address the climate crisis. This is a global challenge that has worsened existing inequalities and vulnerabilities from within and between nations. Climate change has worsened, and the ravages of pandemic. People in the developing countries like the Philippines suffer the most. We cannot afford to suffer more. The Philippines joined the Paris Agreement to fight climate change. We call on all parties, especially those who have not made good their commitment to fight climate change, to honor the same. We call on all parties to strengthen communities and peoples for preparedness and resilience. We're talking about mankind and Earth, our one and only home. Mr. President, the Philippines will continue to protect the human rights of its people, especially from the scourge of illegal drugs, criminality, and terrorism. A number of interest groups have weaponized human rights, some well-meaning, others ill-intentioned. They attempt to discredit the functioning institutions and mechanisms of democratic country and a popularly elected government which in its last 2 years still enjoy the same widespread approval and support. These detractors pass themselves off as human rights advocates while preying on the most vulnerable humans, even using children as soldiers or human shields in encounters. Even schools are not spared from their malevolence and anti-government propaganda. They hide their misdeeds under the blanket of human rights, but the blood oozes through. To move forward, open dialogue and constructive engagement with the United Nations is the key, but this must be done in full respect of the principles of objectivity, non-interference, non-selectivity, and genuine dialogue. These are the fundamental basis for productive international cooperation on human rights. Mr. President, terrorism looms large. As I said at the Aqaba process, the Philippines will do everything and partner with anyone who would sincerely desire to protect the innocent from terrorism in all its manifestations. The Marawi siege, where foreign terrorist fighters took part, taught us that an effective legal framework is crucial. Our 2020 Anti-Terrorism Act shores up the legal framework by focusing on both terrorism and the usual reckless response to it. Its enactment was done pursuant to our commitment and the strict adherence to the relevant Security Council resolution and the UN Global Counter-terrorism strategy. Most importantly, we remain committed to rebuild the stricken community and address the root causes of terrorism and violent extremism in my country. We must remain mindful of our obligation and commitment to the Charter of the United Nations, and as amplified by the 1982 Manila Declaration on the peaceful settlement of international disputes, the Philippines affirms that commitment in the South China Sea in accordance with UNCLOS and the 2016 Arbitral Award. The award is now part of international law, beyond compromise and beyond the reach of passing governments to dilute, diminish, or abandon. We firmly reject attempts to undermine it. We welcome the increasing number of states that have come in support of the award and what it stands for: the triumph of reason over rashness. of law over disorder, of amity over ambition. This, as it should, is the majesty of the law. Mr. President, the global health crisis has further complicated the global security environment. But no aspiration nor ambition can justify the use of weapons that destroy indiscriminately and completely. There is no excuse for deaths that a nuclear war could cause, nor the reckless use of chemicals and biological weapons that can cause mass destruction. These weapons of death puts us all at mortal risk, especially if they fall into the hands of terrorists without a shred of humanity in their soul. We can call all member states to fully implement the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and the Chemical and Biological Weapons Convention. I have asked the Philippine Senate to ratify the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, and importantly, we were among those to sign it first. Mr. President, the Philippines has a long history of opening its doors to the refugees. From the White Russians following the 1917 revolution and the European Jews in the Second World War and the Vietnamese in the late 1960s and the Iranians displaced by the 1979 revolution, among others. The Philippines continue to honor this humanitarian tradition in accordance with our obligation under the 1951 Convention of the Status of Refugees and the 1967 Protocol. But lest we forget, helping the most vulnerable, those displaced by conflict, persecution, and political instability is a shared responsibility of all countries. As I have said many times, the doors of the Philippines are open, as they have always been, to everyone fleeing for safety, such as the Rohingyas. In the face of mounting refugee crisis worldwide, let us work together towards ending the conflicts and conditions that force people to flee their homes. Mr. President, as our societies become more diverse yet interdependent, social cohesion issues come to the fore. Mutual understanding always accompanied by mutual tolerance between those of different faiths and cultures is the only foundation of societies at peace with itself and all others. Finally, I express gratitude to the gallant peacekeepers, including our own, who advance the cause of peace in the most difficult situations. From the Golan Heights in the Middle East to Liberia in West Africa, Filipino peacekeepers put themselves in the front line between the vulnerable and those who seek harm. We are committed to increasing Philippine footprint in UN peacekeeping operation with increased participation of women. Again, Mr. President, to defeat COVID-19 pandemic and other challenges, we must work with seamless unity, which demands complete mutual trust and the conviction that we will win or lose together. We cannot bring back the dead, but we can spare the living, and we can build back better, healthier, and more prosperous and just societies. To this end, we rededicate ourselves to the multilateralism. The UN remains humanity's essential organization, but it is only as effective as we make it. To make significant changes, we need to be bold. We need the same collective courage that finally made the United Nations a reality 75 years ago. We need to act on long-standing recommendations to improve the Security Council's composition and the working together and working methods, to strengthen the role of the General Assembly and to streamline the processes and the operation of the UN. Indeed, to be ready for the new global normal, it cannot be business as usual for the UN. Let us empower the UN, reform it to meet the challenges of today and tomorrow. Let us strengthen it so it can fully deliver its mandate to maintain peace and security, uphold justice and human rights, and promote freedom and social progress for all. After all, we are the United Nations. Thank you.
On behalf of the General Assembly, I wish to thank the President of the Republic of Philippines for the statement just made. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran to introduce an address by the head of state.
Thank you, Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General. I have the honor to introduce the pre-recorded statement of His Excellency Dr. Hassan Rouhani, the President of the Islamic Republic of Iran.
In the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful, all praise belongs to the Almighty God, and peace and blessing upon His Prophet and his household and companions. Mr. President, I am delighted to congratulate you as the representative of our fraternal neighbor, Turkey, on your well-deserved election as President of the 75th session of the United Nations General Assembly. Allow me to wish every success for you, the Honorable Secretary General, and all your colleagues in your efforts to realize the goals and objectives of the United Nations. COVID-19 managed to challenge global management and national governance so seriously that the world's most significant assembly might as well be convening virtually through video conference. COVID-19 is now a common pain for humanity thanks to the rapid growth of science, technology, and the media. This common pain has demonstrated that despite all progress, our ignorance as humans far outweighs our knowledge. COVID-19 is calling us to more humility and humbleness before the Almighty and the truth of creation. It is guiding human societies towards civil piety in promoting social and individual ethics, as well as preventing environmental degradation and manipulation of nature and unhindered interference in the creation. This universal plague that has crossed over the fabricated boundaries of power and wealth reminds us once again, as members of human society, that it would be impossible to confront common global issues without global participation. All of us across the globe are experiencing difficult times during the pandemic. However, my nation, the resilient people of Iran, instead of enjoying global partnership and cooperation, is grappling with the harshest sanctions in history, imposed in blatant and gross violation of the Charter of the United Nations, international agreements, and Security Council Resolution 2231. Ladies, gentlemen, the footage broadcast to the world concerning the treatment of an African American by the US police is reminiscent of our own experience. We instantly recognized the feet kneeling on the neck as the feet of arrogance on the neck of independent nations. For decades, the valiant Iranian nation has paid a similar high price for its quest for freedom and liberation from domination and despotism. However, the Iranian nation has not only resisted the pressure, but flourished and advanced while persistently pursuing its historical and civilizational role as the axis of peace and stability, the harbinger of dialogue and tolerance, and the champion of the fight against occupation and extremism. We stood with the people of Afghanistan against Soviet occupiers, domestic warlords, extremists, Al-Qaeda terrorists, and American occupiers. And we played a pivotal role in all peace and reconciliation processes, be it the 2001 Bonn Conference or still regional initiatives. In the mid-1980s, we called for collective security arrangements in the Persian Gulf, even as all the global and regional powers were backing Saddam Hussein's tanker war. In 2013, we proposed World Against Violence and Extremism, or WAVE, which was unanimously adopted by this Assembly. In 2018, we offered a non-aggression pact to our neighbors, and in 2019, we presented HOPE, or Hormuz Peace Endeavor, to this General Assembly in an effort to enhance peace and stability in the Persian Gulf. We were the first country in the region to stand with the people and government of Kuwait against occupation by Saddam. And it was Iran that foiled his dream of dominating all his former Arab allies. We stood with the people of Iraq against Saddam tyranny, US occupation, and Daesh savagery. We supported all Iraqi, whether Kurd or Arab, Sunni or Shia, Yazidi or Christians, and supported democratic achievements of Iraqi people from the Governing Council in 2003 to all elected governments ever since. We stood alongside the people of Syria against tens of terrorist Takfiri groups, separatists and foreign fighters. Aimed at achieving peace and political stability in Syria. We stood with the people and government of Lebanon against Zionist occupiers, domestic warmongers, and foreign plotters. We never ignored occupation, genocide, forced displacement, and racism in Palestine. And we never made a deal over the Holy Quds and the fundamental rights of the Palestinian people. And in 2012, we presented a democratic solution through referendum in Palestine. We vociferously called for justice against aggression for the besieged people of Yemen and presented a 4-point peace plan at the outset of hostilities in 2015. We fought alone and single-handedly against extremists and Daesh terrorists who claimed to be fighting for Islam in this sensitive region of the world, so that the international community would recognize the true face of Islam, the moderate and rational Islam, and not extremism and demagoguery. Our assassinated hero, martyr General Soleimani, was the champion of the fight against violent extremism in the Middle East and fought to protect all citizens of this region, religious or secular, Muslim or Christian, Shia or Sunni, against medieval reactionaries. And in 2015, we achieved the JCPOA as one of the biggest accomplishments of the history of diplomacy and remained faithful to it in spite of persistent violations by the United States. Mr. President, such a nation does not deserve sanctions. The response to peace is not war. The reward for combating extremism is not assassination. The reaction to the choice of people through the ballot box in Iran, Iraq, and Lebanon is not outside agitation and support for non-democratic processes and street riots. Words and claims are not our yardstick. Actions are. They claimed they came to our region to fight Saddam Hussein, the very monster they had themselves created, nurtured, and financed in his imposed war against Iran, equipping him with chemical weapons and the most sophisticated war machine. They boast to be fighting terrorism and Daesh, while it is they themselves who created this terror network, and they have the audacity to expect regional gratitude for such behavior. They accuse us, without any foundation, of trying to build nuclear weapons, and they impose sanctions on others under the pretext of nuclear proliferation. This is while they have the infamy of being the sole user of atomic bombs in the history of humanity, and while the only possessor of nuclear weapons in West Asia is running their non-proliferation theater. They speak of human rights, while they have targeted through their maximum pressure health, welfare, sustenance, and even the right to life of all Iranians. They are directly involved, along with the regional accomplices, in every single case of occupation, war, and aggression, be it in Palestine, Afghanistan, Yemen, Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Libya, Sudan, or Somalia. Yet they blame Iran for their own inevitable defeats in confronting the will of the people of the region. They have sold hundreds of billions of dollars of weapons to their clients, turning our region into a powder keg. Yet, they try in vain to deprive Iran of its minimum defense requirements and disregard international law and global consensus in order to extend arms restrictions against Iran in contravention of the letter of the United Nations Security Council Resolution 2231. Here, I should express our appreciation to the Presidents of the Security Council for the months of August and September 2020, as well as to 13 of its members, especially Russia and China, who twice said a decisive and resounding no to the unlawful US attempt to exploit the Council and its Resolution 2231. This is a victory not just for Iran, but for the global community during the transitional international order and the post-Western world. A victory that an aspirant of hegemony is humiliated in such self-created isolation. Ladies, gentlemen, where can you find precedent for a government to renege without any reason on the outcome of 13 years of multilateral talks, also attended by its predecessor, shamelessly violate a resolution of the Security Council, and even punish others for abiding by a United Nations Security Council resolution, and simultaneously claim to be seeking negotiations and a big deal? The United States can impose neither negotiations nor war on us. Life is hard under sanctions. However, harder is life without independence. Political freedom at home is important for us. We, as the oldest democracy in the Middle East, are proud of our people determining their destiny and will not trade domestic freedom with foreign interference. Democracy is the sovereign right of a nation and not the right of interference by an outsider, let alone a terrorist and interventionist outsider that remains captive to the illusions of the 19th of August 1953, when its predecessors overthrew the only democracy in the Middle East through a coup d'etat. Dignity and prosperity of our nation are essential for us, and they are attained through diplomacy relying on national will coupled with resilience. We are not a bargaining chip in US elections and domestic policy. Any US administration after the upcoming elections will have no choice but to surrender to the resilience of the Iranian nation. And for the world, today is the time to say no to bullying and arrogance. The era of dominance and hegemony is long over. Our nations and children deserve a better and safer world based on the rule of law. Now is the time for the right choice. I thank you for your attention.
On behalf of the General Assembly, I wish to thank the President of the Islamic Republic of Iran for the statement just made. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of France to introduce an address by the head of state.
Merci.
Thank you, Madam President. I now give the floor Mr. Emmanuel Macron, President of the French Republic. Mr. President of the General Assembly, Mr. Secretary General of the United Nations, ladies and gentlemen, heads of state and government. Last year, we met here in New York for our General Assembly, and at the time, I called upon each and every one of you to have the courage to construct peace and together to shoulder our responsibilities. That courage, I must say, has been more than put to a harsh test by the health, economic, social security shock, which is of unprecedented scope and immediate global crisis, the most immediate one since the creation of our organization 75 years ago. That courage, which from the very first was seen in those men and women who were on the front lines around the world and who still are to heal us, nourish us, accompany us, support us, and hold us, our healthcare and our humanitarian workers. And I want to first take these words to think of them. They expect that we commit and that we work together to build concrete responses together, because this crisis, no doubt, more than any other crisis, demands that we cooperate, demands that we invent new international solutions. First, I believe in science and knowledge, and humanity will overcome this pandemic. A cure will be found. But in that, as we await that moment, everyone knows that we must learn to live with the virus. We have no choice, and the world will learn that we have to live with a new reality which is imposed on all of us, which reveals our vulnerabilities, and which puts us before our immediate responsibilities. This new reality, this new world reality is clear, it's brutal, it's dizzying, and we must face it without falling into despair, without being discouraged, but be lucid as we face it. All of these challenges to which we are faced have been, in recent months, accentuated and exacerbated. The success achieved, or which has been impeded, and there has been much ground lost. The years of progress in fighting other diseases, infectious diseases such as HIV, malaria, and tuberculosis, these are what we need to think of first and foremost. We have lagged behind now with them. 37 million people have fallen once again into abject poverty. Food insecurity is a serious threat and has increased. More than 1 billion students around the world have been affected by closing of schools in 160 countries, and 40 million children were not able to go to first grade and begin their education. Women have been at the forefront of an accumulation of all forms of violence against them, sexual, domestic, and gender-based violence. And given this and many other consequences linked to the pandemic, which has struck our planet and which continues to impact all continents, there is the fracturing of our means of collective action, which has accelerated. And while the only solution can come from our cooperation, the international organizations that we so very much need, the World Health Assembly, all have been accused by various of complacency, of being used by others. The third parties, scientific experts and journalists who were so important in to be able to understand what is happening and act effectively vis-a-vis the crisis, have all been called into question by states' propagandas and by the epidemic of disinformation. Our organization itself has run the risk of impotence. The United Nations Security Council, which is a guarantor of peace and stability, had a great difficulty in coming to an agreement on a humanitarian truce, which we've had to support with every part of our beings. Imagine that, to have so much trouble in agreeing on so little. But our permanent members were not able to, even with the exceptional circumstances, come together as we would like to have seen them do, because several have chosen to showcase their rivalry over the importance of collective effectiveness. All of these cracks which pre-existed the pandemic have led to a hegemonic collision of the powers, a calling into question of multilateralism or the use of it, trampling of international law. All of this is accelerated and deepened and is worsening global destabilization created by the pandemic. We cannot close our eyes. We don't have the right to close our eyes to this. We don't have the opportunity or the luxury to hesitate. This pandemic, for our organization, should serve as an electric shock, as a life-saving wake-up call. It's possible, given this trial, that there are motivations for hope as well. The European Union, beyond the predictions of division and impotence, worked in favor of the crisis and took a historic step of unity, of sovereignty, solidarity, a choice for the future. It is Europe, working with its African partners, which took the initiative of the G20 to help those most vulnerable countries to face the pandemic and to lighten the load of the debt burden, which weighs on their economies and endangers the very future of the continent. For the first time in the G20 finances, we enacted a moratorium on the debt of the poorest countries of Africa. It is Europe that is working with its partners, has made it possible to build the Act A initiative with the means to fight the pandemic and make it available to everyone. And it is Europe working with others that made it possible for the World Assembly of Health to draw the lessons of the pandemic and improve early warning alert systems. It is Europe working with its partners in Asia, America, and the Africas that had the energy to build and propose and bring solutions, solidarity, and action. We need to count on the strength of goodwill, because today's world cannot be left to the rivalry between China and the United States, regardless of the weight in the world that these two great powers share, regardless of the history that ties us, especially to the United States. The crisis, the collapse of our frameworks of cooperation, the fragility I have just referenced, all of that means that we must build a new order, and it means that Europe needs to fully shoulder its responsibility. In other words, bring its values, its taste for the future, and it needs to know how to craft new solutions, because we are not collectively condemned to a two-step dance, which to some extent would reduce everyone else to unfortunate spectators who are collectively impotent. We do have some leeway, and it's up to us to leverage it and to know how to define our priorities in this environment, to clearly make our choices and to forge new alliances. In the coming weeks, there are fundamental choices to be made, decisions to be taken before our people and before the international community. And these choices will have an immediate impact on the life of our nations, on the existence of our fellow citizens, on the running of the world. And we cannot hesitate here. We need to understand that when everything is shaky, that is the time that we need to get back to the basics. I deeply believe that since the very beginning of the COVID crisis, this is not a parenthesis that is opening and that will then close. It is a world beset by deep-seated crises, which are also due to our very interdependence. No doubt there will be a cure for the pandemic at some point, but there will be no miracle cure to the destructuring of the modern order. There will be no miracle cure for this paradox in which we live, one where our societies are so interdependent and at the same time where there's so much disagreement, where we are not in alignment with each other, where we're incapable of finding swift solutions. It's a situation where we ourselves are in a position where we might destroy the very framework of cooperation that we were able to create over recent decades. And that's why I want to say this before this assembly. The 5 main priorities for France, which France wants to build with its European partners, are first and foremost that with all powers of goodwill, that we need to work together to make sure that we are prepared and committed, that we lay the foundation for a new consensus that will make it possible to take specific action in the world as it currently stands. The first principle, the first goal, is combating the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction and terrorism, which are the main threat to our collective security. The strategy of maximum pressure brought to bear over recent years has not made it possible to put an end to the destabilizing activities of Iran, and that's why France, and you will recall, is not the country that started the negotiations that led to the JCPOA agreement. But France and its partners, German and British partners, will maintain its requirement that the agreement be fully implemented, as well as the Vienna 2015 agreement, and will not accept Iran's breaches of this agreement. We will not compromise on the activation of a mechanism which the United States and their own leader in exiting the agreement was not able to activate. That would be to undermine the Security Council and the integrity of its decisions, and it would further exacerbate tensions in the region. But we do need to build a framework for useful action, as I was saying 2 years ago at this very General Assembly. It is up to us to fulfill the 2015 agreement, first in time and over time, to make sure that Iran never has access to a nuclear weapon, but also to ensure that we bring a response to Iran's ballistic activities and also to destabilization in the region. Turning to North Korea now, we have supported efforts undertaken by the United States of America to allow commitment and undertaking of negotiations. Even if tangible results have not yet been achieved, the initiative was important. And what we're looking for now is specific gestures of commitment and engagement by North Korea. It needs to comply with the Security Council resolutions quickly and in good faith. It needs to commit to a denuclearization process which is complete, verifiable, and irreversible. It's the only way to achieve a political solution, lasting peace in the Korean Peninsula. This is unavoidable for the purposes of stability and regional security, and it's also unavoidable for international peace and security. Likewise, we will not tolerate chemical weapons being used in Europe, Russia, or Syria. On behalf of collective security, I restate here to Russia that light needs to be shed on the assassination attempt against a political opponent using a neurotoxic agent, Novichok. This clarification needs to take place quickly and without fault, because we will enforce our red lines. And on this topic, France has always been prepared to enforce the effectiveness of red lines, or at least since I've been President of the Republic. Our collective security is also about combating terrorism everywhere where that is necessary. France was affected several years ago in a repeated manner, affected by terrorism on our soil, in our flesh, affected by terrorist acts which sometimes were fomented in the very heart and epicenter of Islamist terrorism. And here I am thinking specifically of the attacks of 2015 conceived in Syria. This is why France will always be strongly engaged in the Middle East and supporting Iraqi sovereignty, and will stand at the side of its partners in the Sahel. In the Levant, we will continue to be committed alongside the international coalition. We have enjoyed a first victory, the end of the territorial caliphate. But that victory is not the end of the war in the region. We will continue to fight against terrorists in the context of international coalitions and alongside our regional partners. And I want to recall here the role of the Kurd combatants in Syria alongside the coalition fighting Daesh and its terrorists. And I want to here again also recall the essential role played by Iraq and Iraqis, and a role that they will continue to play in this struggle. This is why France supports with strength all initiatives that Iraq is undertaking today, and will continue to do so for its sovereignty and its role in the fight against terrorism. In the Sahel, as you know, France is deeply committed alongside the 5 Sahel states and the summits of Po and then the summit of Nouakchott allowed us to lay the foundation for a coalition to strengthen the fight in the region against our two enemies, the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda. These two organizations have recently suffered unprecedented setbacks, and it has made it possible to focus on the three frontier zones and EIGS zones, which led to tangible and unequaled results. We will continue our work with the support of Barkhane and our European and American partners. The armies of the G5 Sahel have managed to take back the advantage and resume position that had been lost before. This momentum must continue, and it's along these lines that we'd also like to recall a truth here seen in recent weeks, and that is that democracy and the fight against terrorism go hand in hand. These two struggles are inseparable. Only democracy and justice, the rule of law and development will bring lasting peace back to the Sahel. What erupted in Mali under these principles cannot now be betrayed. We must put Mali back on the irreversible path towards a return to civilian power and the organization of elections quickly. France, like its African partners more specifically, can only remain committed under one condition. I state this, and I state it very clearly. France is present on Malian soil, as it's present on other soil countries in the region, at the request of sovereign states and regional organizations. The very minute where these states wish to see our departure or wish to fight terrorism alone, we will withdraw. And thus, reiteration of that request, the need that I have asked for in Pau and then Nouakchott, which was then reconfirmed by the governing junta in Mali. And on this topic, we will remain very vigilant. We believe in the sovereignty of people, and we believe that our action against terrorism can be useful and lasting only if we define the priorities and sovereignty, and if we work towards a bold solution together, collectively. Libya. The crisis has had a profound impact on regional stability and work exacerbated by external interference. The second priority, in my eyes, in coming months for Libya, is the demanding construction of peace and stability while respecting equal sovereignty of peoples. The grammar of peace and stability needs to be redefined because the lines have moved due to the crisis, but actually even before. The American withdrawal, which was supposed to be a last resort guarantor in a system that has been exceeded, and other powers exerting their power, projection of China out beyond its borders, the strengthening of European sovereignties, all of these deeper trends need to lead us to rethink our collective commitments to guarantee peace and security. The principle of action in this area needs to be clear, and our hand must not tremble in enforcing the respect of sovereignty of peoples, the rule of law, means of action, the demands and responsibilities to ensure effective implementation of decisions undertaken under the auspices of the United Nations. That's exactly what we are doing in Lebanon, where the aspirations of the Lebanese sovereign people need to be respected, heard, and supported, regardless of the misguided ways of the Lebanese political class. And here I must restate my full support for the Lebanese people and my determination to act where I am and in full respect and support of the Lebanese people, with demanding friendship, as I often say, so that life can be improved, and also so that the path towards peace and democracy, which is more effective, can be found. But Lebanon is a treasure for all of humanity. It's a treasure because it's a kind of exception of democracy and pluralism in a region which is pushed around by terrorism and hegemonic powers. The United Nations needs to specifically, as it did as it's done in the past and over time, it needs to be committed alongside civil society and NGOs to meet the immediate needs and undertake reconstruction. Syria. The resumption of talks in Geneva under the auspices of the United Nations is a positive step, but the process cannot be limited just to drafting a new constitution. It needs to also include transparent, regular, and free elections and respect the aspirations and sovereignty of the Syrian people. France and its European partners will thus continue to tie financing of reconstruction and normalization of relations with Damascus, tie it to a credible political solution, a lasting solution. It's the only way to eradicate terrorism in the region. Peace in the Middle East is a need, it's a requirement, first for the Israelis and the Palestinians, but for all of us. I am pleased that Israel has obtained recognition by 2 new Arab states. It's legitimate recognition. It's also a gauge of hope for the future. But still, lasting and fair peace first and foremost requires decisive negotiations that will allow Palestinians to finally enjoy their rights. There is no alternative to courageous negotiations, which will in turn require an agreement on the most thorny issues, while respecting the legitimate aspirations of each side and in the full recognition of and security and sovereignty of each. I do not believe in a peace that would be built on hegemony or humiliation, or even less if it were to be compensated by money. Because we know too much. We know that humiliation cannot be compensated by money for a people. It's up to us then, collectively, to work towards a bold solution. In Libya now, the crisis has henceforth had a deep-seated impact on regional stability and been worsened by external interference. Libya, in our eyes, is the perfect illustration of errors that can take place when we do not respect the sovereignty of people. No power can build the well-being of a people unless it's wished so itself and built it itself through transition as it desired. Also, we need to make choices very specifically, as is done in Europe, to effectively respect the embargo or arms embargo decided by the United Nations. This embargo has been violated by a number of powers, and that is not sustainable. A number of powers have continued to import combatants from the Syrian theater, thereby exporting terrorism to the region, despite the interests of Libya, despite the interests of the Sahel neighbors or Europe. Collectively, we have been too silent about these actions, and we need to speak up much more in the coming weeks. We're working together with our partners in the neighboring countries of Libya in order to obtain a lasting ceasefire and then to start a process which will allow for the peaceful resolution of conflict under the auspices of the United Nations. It's France's initiative to lead in coming weeks to work with the Secretary General of the United Nations to bring together all the neighboring countries of Libya. This recommitment of the neighboring countries is necessary over the term.
In the Eastern Mediterranean, we have to commit to an effective, clear dialogue to avoid a new space of confrontation which would jeopardize international law. The Mediterranean countries of the European Union have spoken clearly in favor for this, as they did a few days ago in Ajaccio. We respect Turkey. We are ready for dialogue with her, but we expect her to respect European sovereignty, international law, and to provide clarification about her action in Libya and in Syria. Insults are fruitless. And all of these words and all of these acts only have a place in responsible relations, well, do not have a place in responsible relations between states. Calling for responsibility is what we need. We as Europeans are ready for dialogue and for the indispensable the construction of a Pax Mediterranea, but not at the price of intimidation, might is right, and so on. What we need is respect for international law and cooperation, respect between allies. When it comes to the Ukrainian crisis, the Normandy format has allowed us, with the German Chancellor, to make some progress, but the situation in Belarus brings with it the risk of a new fracture in our continent. The courage of the Belarusian people brings the admiration of all. These aspirations should be respected, and we stand shoulder to shoulder with them. And I want to put that quite strongly. A national political dialogue should be set up, and any meddling from outside should be avoided. Together with the Chancellor of Germany and with the President of the Council, we had the opportunity to talk to President Putin and to advocate for the mediation as proposed by the OSCE. We see no other option. We say no to intervention, no to guilty silence. Europe also must be up to its responsibilities, to its history and its geography. But believing in peace and stability in our region also means wanting to build for the continent of Europe a new paradigm of some kind for a sustainable stability. And this cannot be reduced to historic agreements, nor ultimately to the dismantling of those agreements that we have seen in recent years. When we talk about peace, stability and collective security for Europe, I cannot avoid today the fact that we are living in a situation where our security and stability very largely depended on agreements that were signed in the past between the United States of America and the Soviet Union, and that these agreements have been progressively dismantled over the last 10 years. The end of the INF Treaty marked an important step that we must address. This is why I hope that we Europeans can recommit to a complete and ambitious discussion with all of our neighbours for our collective security, and to build the new paradigm which will take into account the end of these historic treaties. I put this also very clearly. We cannot delegate our collective security to other powers outside Europe. Thirdly, we must protect our common goods. This is our shared responsibility and goes beyond our national interests or our regional balances. Protecting our common goods does not run counter to our sovereignty. It is rather the only way for us to really maintain it by keeping control of our own destiny. This is exactly what the crisis that we are going through shows us once again in incontestable fashion. The health of one person in the face of an epidemic is the health of all, and we have a unique opportunity to make the means of combating the pandemic public goods at global level that everybody should have access to. This is the rationale behind our action within Act A, and which we will aim to roll out in the coming months over a number of areas, including strengthening healthcare systems. Health is a public good, a global public good. That's a battle that we have waged in recent years, and that we also carried out in Lyon when it was a question of remobilizing the international community to finance the fight against epidemics in the past. And this is what we will continue to do, and we must do this even more forcefully in the months to come. The climate and biodiversity must also be at the heart of our collective agenda, not in words but in actions. In December, it will be 5 years since the Paris Agreement was signed, and we already know that the objectives that we set collectively will not be achieved. The response to the pandemic can change everything. The recovery plans adopted across broad scales in many countries are a historic opportunity for us to transform our economies and development. This should be at the heart of the ambition of the European Union, and I thank the President of the Commission for her commitment. This must be at the heart of our work in the G7 and the G20. It's essential, and so this is also why I would like France to mark the 5th anniversary of the Paris Agreement by once again mobilizing the international community, so that each of us can look at where we are on our commitments without changing the measurement, if you like, or without any obfuscation or confusion, but by remobilizing our countries and our regions in total transparency, but in a spirit that is proactive. Europe will reach an agreement in the coming weeks to address its aim for carbon neutrality by 2050. The President of the European Commission set the target of reducing greenhouse gases by at least 55% in 2030. This means we need to work more quickly and more powerfully on an ambitious emissions trading system, a minimum price for carbon, and a carbon border tax. These measures constitute a totality between themselves. One will not be as effective without the others. Alongside our British and European partners, we will look for commitments from the large emitters with a view to COP26, and we will be alongside our partners to meet their objectives. The meeting in December will be essential in this respect. In November, we will meet in Paris with the development banks to ensure that financial flows contribute to a recovery that is environmentally friendly and in solidarity. On biodiversity, whose links with climate change and human health have already been established, we will organise a meeting in Marseille with the United Nations, the World Bank. It will be a One Planet summit that will allow us to build an agenda of specific actions on protected areas at land and at sea, agroecology, financing for biodiversity, and the fight against deforestation, as well as the protection of ecosystems and species. The oceans and seas, the poles, and the tropical forests belong to humanity's global heritage. We should protect them, and we will do this in view of the decisive deadlines that have been set for the United Nations through the COP conferences on the climate, biodiversity, and the fight against desertification. In order to meet our deadlines, I propose that a summit be organised next year in New York in advance of these 3 COP conferences to give them a decisive impetus and to reach tangible results. The digital space is also a common good, a unique common good, open and trusting, which should be subject to new governance so that it is not captured, pirated or instrumentalized. This is the rationale behind the initiatives that we are carrying out through the Information and Democracy Partnership of the Christchurch Appeal, as well as on the Global Partnership on Artificial Intelligence. We should consolidate each of these partnerships and make progress on the Akaba process. Here I welcome the commitment of the Prime Minister of New Zealand as well as the King of Jordan on this agenda. These are now specific actions, but above all now we need not only commitments but also actions from the large operators, actions from the large-scale platforms, and commitment from all to legislate and to regulate at regional level in order to meet our commitments. The fight against hatred, the fight against terrorism, the creation ultimately of a public order on the internet are as important as in technological innovation and freedom, because there can be no freedom without public order. We need international commitment, and I don't think that the protection of the freedom of expression can accommodate terrorist discourse, hate speech, or the anonymity that in some way covers for a lack of inhibition in violence. This agenda is essential so that for all of us, and we will continue to work on it powerfully. Finally, and I say this in a context which is that marked by the epidemic, education is an essential common good that we will continue to commit to in the years to come. Hundreds of millions of our young people have left education because of the epidemic, but education, in particular the education of girls, continues to be a priority, particularly in Africa. Side by side with President Macky Sall, we are committed to the Global Partnership for Education. We have raised new funds to finance the actions within this partnership. The role today of the World Bank, the United Nations, the Global Partnership for Education, UNESCO, the role also of our bilateral actions should be strengthened to work more effectively in the months and years to come to improve education, in particular for girls. This fight is not over, far from it, and we will not forget it. It is at the heart of France's commitment on defence and to fight for global public goods. Our fourth priority is building a new era of globalization. The first era of globalization was opened by the journeys of Christopher Columbus and of Magellan, the era of discovery, the first invasions as well, of a kind of trial and error, a kind of fascination and, on occasion, of mutual misunderstanding. The second was the era of colonial empires and the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century. This was globalization through trade, the first openings, but also slave routes, exploitation, development of some, and the enslavement of others, the first movements of the population, and a recomposition of our world along the line of these dominations. The third era began in 1989 with the fall of the Berlin Wall, the opening of borders, the creation of a belief in the possibility that the circulation of goods and people, and then the generalization of the internet, could lead to a convergence of interests, values, and ideas. Ultimately, it is in this era of globalization, which I'm galloping through, that we could separate each of these eras into different periods, but it is this third which has been challenged for 10 years now, because the deep conviction, the teleology that accompanied it, was that this globalization would be the globalization of peace, a rapprochement of values, a universalization of respect for the other. And it has been challenged because the financial crisis, the transformations in the world, the return of peoples, national consciences, and ultimately because of the global pandemic. It's also been challenged by a deep crisis, the crisis in the middle classes in the West, which at some moment feared that this new order, that some had called a happy globalization, they feared what it might bring them. These middle classes, which above all in the West, have often been part of economic and cultural variables of this world that is thus open. So we cannot deny everything that this period has brought in terms of progress, all of that this third era of the mobilization has allowed us to bring in terms of prosperity. It has brought hundreds of millions of people out of poverty precisely by the redistributions brought about by trade and global production. And openness has allowed us to be aware of the journeys and the circularization that has in part brought peace to our relations. And it would be dangerous to close ourselves into a kind of generalized protectionism through customs and through trade wars in a space of doubt that would lead us to close down, or to give into a logic of power, because we can see that this crisis cannot be solved through turning in on nationalism or the violence of populism or extremism, or by the return to thinking only of power. But it is clear that the chains of value at global level need to be rethought today, because the crisis has shown that the dependence of strategic sectors such as healthcare, the digital sector, artificial intelligence, and food can jeopardize the free exercise of sovereignty. But we also have seen that there are good dependencies, and there are dependencies also alongside those that make us fragile. We need to keep international trade and openness, because it is good for us in economic and social terms, and because we cannot bring everything back into an internal level, because that, and also because of the dependencies that are imposed by cooperation. But the complete dependence on some powers, whether these are technological, food or industrial, create vulnerabilities which will not allow us to establish the balances that go hand in hand with our global world. Finally, the inequalities in this new global order are also unsustainable. We have brought hundreds of millions of people out of poverty in certain countries. We have reduced some of the north-south inequalities, but we have created inequalities within our countries. And this new order makes these things unsustainable in democratic terms. We've also created a globalization of conscience, which is today a globalization not of the knowledge that underlies the internet, but it's become the globalization of emotion and resentment. In each of these crises, we have to provide a response. It is this strategy that the European Union is trying to come up with, as are other powers. It is essential that our international rules are adapted to take account of these new realities, and that they give us the means for international cooperation that is balanced and that respects the sovereignty of each to the benefit of all. The fight against inequality should very clearly be at the heart of our new globalization. France has provided initiatives that have brought results in female entrepreneurship, global partnership on education, health for all, the fight against inequality, but we have to go further. In some way, as you can certainly see, the world that we live in is based on an academic consensus that has become a political consensus and a consensus in the market, what we often call the Washington consensus. It has survived. We need to lay the foundations of a globalization that is fairer, more balanced, more equitable, and more lasting. We must think of the terms for a globalization that it can rethink the terms of a fair sovereignty and of fair trade, which integrates at the heart of its being the fight against inequalities in all of their forms, whether because of gender, the economy, the fight against climate change, and for biodiversity, which allows us in lasting fashion to integrate a new global balance. Here again we can make specific proposals in a few weeks at the Paris Forum. The work begun with the European Commission, the International Monetary Fund, and many other powers in good faith will be essential. Africa, with Europe, will be the driver for this redefinition of globalization. That is why we will continue our efforts as part of the initiative that we have built to help African countries to face the pandemic in health, economic, social, and humanitarian terms. November's G20 will be decisive in implementing a debt moratorium that we have acted for, and also to go further. We must also better support the immense energy of civil society, of the young people in Africa, who are its power and its future. This is the rationale behind the initiatives that we will produce in the coming months with the diasporas and with the support and in supporting the African private sector. Finally, the fifth objective that I would here like to propose for our collective is respect for international humanitarian law and the fundamental rights of each person. I believe that this is essential to the very survival of our organization. Indeed, in this area we've seen a series of setbacks and very often too much silence. Since the creation of the United Nations of a global humanitarian day, 5,000 workers have been attacked and 1,800 have been murdered. Last year was the deadliest. And I have a particular thought for those young French men and women who within the organization acted, were working exactly in this framework in Niger, and who were killed in terrible conditions last August. The United Nations cannot remain inactive in the face of this regression. This is why, with French NGOs and with our international partners, we are building an initiative to ensure the effectiveness of international law, the protection of humanitarian personnel, and the fight against impunity. The humanitarian space is a common legacy that we have to protect by guaranteeing access for civilians and for the personnel who support them to protection. We have seen setbacks here. We've also seen the practices, including by permanent members of the Security Council, of unacceptable action, in particular in Syria. The neutrality of humanitarian action needs to be respected, and we must prevent it from being criminalized. Taking on our responsibilities in the humanitarian sector is also evidence of our solidarity and our humanity, and this also must be addressed when it comes to migration. The situation in Greece at Moria is very difficult. France, alongside Germany and its partners, will take on its responsibilities in hosting refugees. We must act together to manage migration flows, to end human trafficking, to end crossings that lead to death, and to end people being compelled to take on these journeys. This will be at the heart of our European agenda in the coming weeks. I'll have the opportunity to come back to this. We must intensify our fight against traffickers and must meet our responsibilities. Finally, fundamental rights are not a Western idea that we can oppose as an intervention on all those that refer to them. They are the principles of our organization that are enshrined in the text that the members of the United Nations freely consented to and signed up to respect. That is the reason why, in particular, France has asked for an international mission under the aegis of the United Nations to go to Xinjiang to take into account the concerns that we have collectively about the situation of the Uyghur Muslim minority. we also cannot tolerate that 25 years after the Beijing conference, the rights of women are also seeing a deep setback, and for that reason, next summer we will organise the Forum Generation Equality with UN Women and with civil society for the emancipation of all, education of girls, and the real and effective exercising of human rights. These are the 5 principles on which France wishes to build the foundations of an international order, so that the foundations of our organisation are not shaken by this pandemic. On the contrary, we have to take change by the hand before it takes us by the neck, as Winston Churchill said. This requires the establishment of international cooperation that is functional, based on clear, defined rules respected by all. Multilateralism is not just an act of faith, it is an operational necessity. No country can manage this challenge alone. International cooperation can be difficult, but it is an objective imperative. That said, we can no longer content ourselves with a multilateralism in words, which allows us to just agree on some lowest common denominator as a way of masking our deep divergences behind a facade. We have to change the method and also be clear that that we have to agree to alliances and principles. Multilateralism in this modern world should also involve international organisations, private stakeholders, businesses, the NGOs, researchers and citizens, so that each is a true stakeholder in the actions we commit to. It should be built on a solid basis that is respected and verified between partners in good faith around clear objectives and rules, with a true responsibility and accountability mechanisms. That is why, at the Paris Peace Forum in November, we will make an effort alongside our European and African partners, and with all those who wish to in Asia, America and elsewhere, to lay the foundations of this new international consensus to the benefit of the future of our organisation. I don't believe in some grand day of refoundation. I believe in determined, methodical, rigorous work to build a modern international order, which will allow us to spare future generations this scourge of war, to reaffirm human rights and equality between nations, to promote social progress in greater freedom. That is the very promise of our Charter. It is highly timely. I believe in the power of will, in the value of sincerity and of courage. And in talking to you at this time, despite the distance created across our screens, I have in memory the face of a Lebanese girl who I met a few days ago, who had lost everything, but who vowed to fight for everything that she believed in. It's also the memory of those young French citizens killed in Niger because they believed in a world of humanity, solidarity and fraternity. It's the same memory that many of you will certainly have, and which obliges us to act, and which prevents us from falling into cynicism, which requires us to act, and that prevents us from giving into discouragement or facile solutions. There are lives, above all, there are boys and girls who are committed around the world because they believe in our words, because they live for and by our principles. If we betray them, we are those who are the most guilty for their disillusionment and the fact that they lose everything. So it is up to us to act. I know that we are able. In any case, we will do everything that we can, and I know that many colleagues are also ready. I am counting on each person among you. Thank you.
On behalf of the General Assembly, I wish to thank the President of the French Republic for the statement just made. We have heard the last speaker and then the general debate for this meeting. The fifth plenary meeting to continue with the general debate will begin at 3 p.m. Before adjourning the meeting, may I remind members of the mitigation measures, especially the physical distancing requirements in and around the room. This meeting is adjourned.
Circuit for the Reuters live service. This is the primary audio circuit for the Reuters live service. This is the primary audio circuit for the Reuters live service. This is the primary audio circuit for the Reuters live service. This is the primary audio circuit for the Reuters live service. This is the primary audio circuit for the Reuters live service.